Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Nick Halaris Show. Our guest this week is Jack Malde, a Senior Policy Analyst at the Bipartisan Policy Center, and the co-host of the show, the podcast This Week in Immigration. Jack is an expert on immigration policy, and I wanted to take this opportunity to lay the groundwork about the status quo in America, and I couldn't think of a better person than Jack. So, Jack, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Nick.
I thought maybe a good place to start, just to level set, is tell us a little bit about what you do and also a little bit about the Bipartisan Policy Center.
Yeah, so the Bipartisan Policy Center, we're a DC-based think tank, and we really focus on finding areas of common ground between Republicans and Democrats so that we can work with lawmakers from both parties to enact change that has that bipartisan support, because we think bipartisan solutions are more durable solutions. And yeah, so in my role, I'm a senior policy analyst in immigration and workforce policy. So looking primarily at our legal immigration system and how it can support our economy, and also looking at our domestic workforce. I do some work on that side of things as well. And I just want to say a little bit about BPC and immigration policy. So what we really want is comprehensive immigration reform. So that is change to our legal immigration system, but also changes to our border and asylum policy, and also enabling some of these undocumented immigrants who have been in the United States for a long time to come here and stay. So that's what we really want. But what we have been working on recently is focusing on legal immigration reform specifically. So we did some polling in 2021, which showed that legal immigration reform is perhaps the best area for bipartisan action, because both parties generally agree that expanding legal immigration to support the economy and fill jobs has broad support across both parties. So that's where we've been focusing our recent attention the most. So yeah, comprehensive immigration reform is the dream, but we're quite a pragmatic think tank, and we think about where's the best potential for reform, and so that's where my work has been focused recently.
Yeah. Before we zoom in on that topic, I want to just take a step back and discuss or get your take on bipartisanship in general. I recently interviewed a gentleman named Nick Troiano, who runs a philanthropic venture fund, and who just wrote a book called The Primary Solution. And his contention, or his mission, is basically trying to reform the primary elections because of the serious lack of bipartisan work in Congress in the last 20 years. Like, what is the BPC's perspective on the state of bipartisanship in America?
Yeah, and you've just reminded me, something I should mention is BPC works across many different policy areas. So we actually do have a team that works on democracy and elections. We have a team that works on energy policy, the economy, fiscal tax policy. I could go on. So we recognize that bipartisanship is important across many different policy areas. And we think it's not only possible, but it's essential bipartisanship, because, well, certainly at the moment we have a divided Congress. So the House is controlled by Republicans and the Senate by Democrats. And bipartisanship is, in a way, the only way to get meaningful change. And as I mentioned before, it's the way to get durable change as well. That it's not just going to be reversed by the next Congress, because essentially both parties agree with the change that was enacted. So, and there, BPC, there is bipartisanship. There are bipartisan bills that get passed through Congress, and so we think it's also it's possible to get that change as well. So it's not only important, but it's the only way forward.
Yeah. In the book, in this book, The Primary Solution, there's these charts. What made me think about it is that there's these charts that looked at congressional voting patterns over the last maybe 60 or 70 years on major legislation. And it's crazy. Like if you rewind the clock there's a ton of crossover voting between Dems and Republicans, and if you look at the last several decades, there's nothing in the middle. Like there's yays and nays on the side, and they never sort of meet in the middle, at least on the major stuff, which is obviously a problem if you want to have a functioning democracy. So I really appreciate the work that you guys are doing at the Bipartisan Policy Center.
No, yeah, I really appreciate that, and it's why I wanted to work for BPC, is because of that pragmatic approach we take, the fact that we want to find those solutions and work together with both sides to get them done. And it's also, we just have to keep emphasizing the need for bipartisanship, so that there is some polarization in our society, and we just have to fight against that and remind people of the importance of it as well.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for that. Everyone in the universe, or at least in this country, is talking about the border, and we're not going to talk about the border, even though it's tempting to spend this entire conversation dissecting the pros and cons of all the arguments. In the spirit of the Bipartisan Policy Center's mission and your kind of opening remarks, I feel like the better topic is the one that no one's talking about, which is what you mentioned earlier, which is legal immigration. Because it seems like there is the opportunity to fix that system, which my understanding, and you can get into this in a second, is it hasn't really been addressed in something like 30 years. Like there's been no change in the framework for how we actually legally process immigrants. So I thought what we could do for the next little while is, why don't we just go through that? Like, how does this system work today?
That sounds great. And I would say, the border is a super important policy area as well. But yeah, I'm not an expert in that side of the immigration policy debate. So I'm happy to talk about how our legal immigration system works. And you're entirely right. We haven't seen meaningful reform since 1990 with the Immigration Act of 1990. And that is over 30 years ago. So that's actually before I was born. And the problem is we have changing circumstances. We have changing economic needs, and we need our laws to update in line with those. So that's a big issue, the fact that we haven't had reform for so long. Just to dive into how the system works today. So one key distinction when it comes to legal immigration is between permanent and temporary immigration. So we have, I'm sure most listeners have heard of green cards. So these are also called immigrant visas, and they're given to people to indicate lawful permanent resident status, so enabling people to stay in the country indefinitely. We also have temporary visas. So these are called non-immigrant visas, and in many cases, these are for people who are legally authorized to work for some period of time for a specific job for a specific employer. And many of those people on temporary visas want to transition to permanent status. Some of them don't. But something, it's a big feature of our system, is that it's very difficult to transition to permanent status. And I can talk a bit more about that.
One quick follow-up on that before we move on. Do you have the numbers? Like what is the annual green card issuance and the temporary visa issuance look like?
Yeah, so, well, one thing I would mention is that we have these annual limits that were set in law. And so I can give you an idea of what those limits are. So for green cards, the overall limit is 675,000 each year. And that's broken down into employment-based limit and family-based limit. So some people are sponsored by employers to work in a job, and only 140,000 are for employment-based green cards. Whereas for family-based green cards, we have a limit of 480,000. So these are when US citizens are sponsoring family members for green cards. I don't have, the number of people coming in on these different types of green cards does vary each year. but that those annual limits give you the demand exceeds the supply, so that gives a good indication of the numbers that are able to come in. But I would say as well that some people who are getting these employment-based green cards, for example, are already in the country and they're adjusting from temporary status. So those numbers aren't exactly the inflows each year, but they do give an indication of the total um, number of people getting green cards each year.
Yeah, and that number, just to put the context, like America has a population of 330 million. And so it's like a very small percentage of people are able to avail themselves of at least the permanent visa option.
Absolutely, it's very small. It hasn't been changed since 1990, uh, and we can go on to talk about why really it's much too small given our economic needs. And the other thing I would emphasize is that imbalance between the family-based and the employment-based limits. So I said the family-based limit is 480,000, the employment-based limit is 140,000. So we have a system which is prioritizing the family reunification over our economic needs. And I think both are important, but we need ideally to rebalance that given the fact that our economy is so in need of workers at the moment.
Yeah. When I wrote an article about this for my newsletter maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and I didn't do an exhaustive research, but I did some, and I read some of the testimony that the big companies like Google and Microsoft were giving in front of Congress about this issue. And it was really like jarring data for me. I forget the numbers, but there were these thousands, maybe I don't know how many thousands of people that could be employed in high paying jobs by American tech companies, not just tech companies, American companies in general, that are not being granted visas. And the more shocking one and the more problematic one too is we have all these people who are going to our elite schools and then not being granted a permanent visa. And to me, that makes no sense. Like I'm a big supporter of the family stuff too, but we live in a competitive world, and it's insane to me that we would educate all these people at our best schools and then send them off to go compete against our companies in another place. It makes absolutely no sense. So I feel like that is like low hanging fruit. But all right, so we talked about the permanence and the temporary. What are some of the other features in the family versus employment? What are some of the other features that are worth knowing about?
Yeah, so I can explain the green card system in a little bit more detail. So I already mentioned that there are family-based green cards given out each year. There are employment-based green cards given out. We also have there's a humanitarian aspect to our green card system. So asylees and refugees can apply for a green card after 1 year. And we also have this thing called the diversity lottery. So 50,000 visas are given, 50,000 green cards are given out annually through a lottery system for countries that have sent relatively few immigrants to the US in the past 5 years. So the idea behind that is just to increase the diversity of country of origin of the immigrants that are in the United States. So there are multiple objectives of our permanent immigration system. So family reunification, supporting our economy, humanitarian aspects, and diversity. So it's a complicated system. That's one thing I would emphasize. And I already mentioned that the family-based aspect is the dominant one. So that's the green card system. There's a lot more I could say, but I'll probably leave it there. And I can go on talk a little bit about the temporary system as well.
That's one of the sort of issues about the border is that we have all these asylum seekers or depending on who you believe, like they're either genuine asylum seekers or they're just trying to exploit the system. And it's unclear to me, like what happens to those people in the 1 year period. Like, can they work? Let's say you come here and you're waiting for your 1 year. Are you allowed to work? What happens to you if you're an asylum seeker in this country?
Yeah, there are unfortunately, so not all the asylees do have work authorization. Um, so that is a big point of contention. We have a lot of people who are waiting for asylum. They aren't able to contribute to our economy, so they end up uh, in shelters, and this is obviously not helping anyone. It's not helping them. It's not helping our economy. So this would be a big, very impactful change we could make, is if we could give work authorization to more of these asylum seekers while they're waiting in our country for a final determination. There are certain programs that the Biden administration has enacted that does allow for some of these humanitarian immigrants to work. So we've had this. There's this thing called humanitarian parole, where people can be sponsored by U.S. citizens to come to the country on a humanitarian basis, and they're allowed to work. And certain countries are also given temporary protected status, so that they are allowed to get work authorization as well. So, but there's this big problem with the asylum system, in that a lot of asylum seekers are not able to contribute to our economy, and instead they are forced into these shelters, and yeah, you read about that in the news quite a lot as well.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems like the to me the recurring theme around this whole policy debate is like, it just doesn't make any sense. Like, what are we doing? Like, even back to what we just briefly talked about with the college kids. Like, what possible reason do we have for not letting someone who graduates from Harvard have a permanent visa in this country? It literally doesn't make any sense. But I interrupted you. You're about to get into the temporary visa, so why don't we do that now?
Yeah, so there are more than 20 categories of temporary visas, so I won't go through each one. But one of them I will flag is the H-1B visa, or the specialty occupation visa. So these are people who with specialized knowledge. They tend to work in our tech sector, a lot of them working on computing roles. So they're vital for our economy, for our competitiveness, for our national security. And again, this visa has a limit, an annual limit. So it's 65,000. It's a very small number. And there's a 20,000 additional for people with advanced degrees. And the H-1B visa is one of the few temporary visas that has what we call dual intent. So people are allowed to seek permanent resident status if they come in on an H-1B visa. But there's only one other category of temporary visa where there is also dual intent, and for all the others, we're really disincentivizing or making it impossible for people to stay in the country. So that is obviously not desirable from an economic perspective. And another thing I'd say about the H-1B visa, as with all of these visas, the demand exceeds the supply. So when we get more people than the limit allows, we have an H-1B lottery where the visas are given out randomly. So that also doesn't make much sense, because we should really be prioritizing those who are most important for our economy, for our country. So there are a lot of things that could be improved on the temporary side as well.
Yeah. A couple follow-up questions on that. On the H-1Bs, maybe this isn't a question, it's more a comment. When I was reading the testimony about that, what was fascinating about it is that these American executives were telling Congress, like, guess what we're going to do? We're going to go open up shop in Canada or Ireland and other places that had more favorable immigration policies, and put those people there and pay them, 6-figure salaries. which I just found shocking that the members of Congress kind of heard that information and still couldn't make an adjustment to the H-1B number. Why do you think that is? Like, what's going on in that particular case that is preventing Congress from doing something that seems like an absolute policy no-brainer?
Yeah, well, I just want to say that Canada is, yeah, it's poaching people because they are stuck in our system and are struggling for years to get green cards. And why haven't we increased this cap? Well, honestly, it's multiple reasons. Firstly, we have again wide agreement from both parties that we should be increasing immigration for our economic needs, but you do have the extreme ends of each party who are against this, and so we are finding that some bipartisan attempts are being stymied uh, in light of that. But also, there've been comprehensive immigration reform attempts, as I mentioned before, combining border security and enabling undocumented immigrants who've been in the United States for a long time to stay in the country and to have legal immigration reform all in one. And those attempts as well tend to fail, partly because there are things in there that each party doesn't like. So Republicans aren't really interested in enabling these undocumented immigrants to get green cards, to get citizenship, whereas Democrats, historically at least, have been opposed to the border reforms that have been proposed. Of course, we saw this recent bipartisan border deal. So there have been just challenges in getting this buy-in to get this comprehensive reform. And I think that one approach going forward is to focus on smaller incremental change. And we are seeing some bipartisan bills that are focused on legal immigration reform and supporting our economy. So one, for example, is the Eagle Act, which is a bipartisan bill. And one feature of that bill is that we would be reserving some green cards for shortage occupations, occupations where we don't have enough workers. I think the issue as well when it comes to something like that which is a bipartisan bill, which is out there, is that a lot of the oxygen on this debate is being taken up by the border, and there's a lot of politics behind around that as well. So it's looking more like we need to get an agreement on the border and to implement border reforms before we're really going to be able to consider these legal immigration reforms, because that's where all the attention is at the moment. And so I think solving the border issue might be the key to unlocking the legal immigration reforms, which both parties generally do agree on.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like the border is such an emotional issue, and it's a headline grabbing issue that no one wants to talk about the nuances about H-1Bs, and maybe the cap should be 200,000 instead of 65,000 when they're talking about whatever the number is of encounters on the border per month, the millions of encounters on the border. I sort of get it from an emotional standpoint, but from a just like a raw, like real politique standpoint, this is an area where America should be winning. This is our strategic advantage. People want to live here because we have this rule of law, we have the economic opportunity and the cultural dominance and all the things that make this country special. And we could drain, in my view, like we could brain drain the entire world if we wanted to. But we're caught up talking about other stuff and not focused on doing that for many reasons, obviously. One question in the weeds on this temporary visa, you mentioned this concept of the dual intent, and I'm just curious: is that basically like a paperwork thing? Like if you're granted a visa that doesn't have a dual intent, you can't even apply for the green card. Is that what that refers to, or is it more complicated than that?
It's basically, yeah, that's right. Like if you're not on a dual intent temporary visa, there's no opportunity for you to get a green card.
I see. So you'd have to
When you're
leave the country basically, and then if you wanted to go for permanent, you'd have to leave the country and then apply for that route instead.
Yeah, you'd have to. The best way would be to be sponsored by an employer for an H-1B visa, which is obviously, as I mentioned, a temporary visa, or for a green card. So you can go from H-1B to green card, or you can go straight to green card. But if you're on these temporary visas without dual intent, then you'll have to leave the country when your temporary stay is over.
Man. Okay, well, now that we've got the framework established for how people actually legally get into America, let's talk about why it's a good idea to look at reforming this and maybe examine the prospects for change over the next several years or administrations, depending on how long it takes. So why don't we start with the why?
Yeah, so at BPC, we're emphasizing, I guess, three key arguments for legal immigration reform. So firstly, for our economy. Secondly, for our national security, and also for our international competitiveness. So I'll start with our economy. And one of the key arguments here is that we have an aging population in the United States. So a growing proportion of our population is over 65. They are dependent on federal benefits like Social Security. And we really need a strong labor force to work and pay taxes to support these people. But as I say, we have an aging population. So we're having a shrinking working force as a proportion of our total population. And this is partly because we have a declining birth rate. So women are having fewer children. Also, when you have an aging population, you have more people who are older. They don't have children in their older years of life. So that's another driver of our declining birth rate. And what this means is that, our labor force is set to shrink past a certain point. So the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, predicts that our death rate will exceed our birth rate by 2040. And after that point, any population growth or any labor force growth is going to have to be from immigration. So in the absence of immigration, we'd just have a continually aging population. And at a certain point, we just wouldn't have the tax revenues to be able to support these people who are in the older years of life. So that's really a key economic argument for why we need immigration to support our workforce. And I would just say that the Congressional Budget Office, again, last week they released their economic and budget outlook over the next 10 years. And they project huge economic gains from immigration over the next 10 years. And their reasoning is that a large proportion of immigrants are of prime working age, so between the ages of 25 and 54. And they work more than our domestic population. So they would offset declining labor force participation due to our aging population. And the result is, over the next 10 years, is a massive GDP boost of $7 trillion, and actually a federal tax revenue boon of $1 trillion. So this is perhaps the most compelling economic argument is we have an aging population and we need a growing workforce to support these people who are dependent on federal benefits.
Yeah, it's such a good point. And if I understand the math right, like essentially in the 20th century in this country, but this is probably true of almost all the major developed countries, they set up these sort of pay-as-you-go systems where, like Social Security, where the benefits are taxed from the people who are working and paid out to people who are not working. And it looked great in the beginning because there weren't that many people who were drawing from the system, but now the reverse is happening and about to get worse. Like in the absence of immigration and that $7 trillion boon to GDP and the $1 trillion of increased federal tax the numbers on Social Security and Medicare are like frightening. Like the deficit is going to blow out of control like relatively soon, right? Like within what, several decades. If we didn't have immigration, like how bad do the numbers look?
Well, yeah, I mean, if we didn't have immigration, we'd have declining, as I said, a declining population from 2040. And I don't have figures on how bad things would look. I would recommend people have a look at the CBO documentation in a bit more detail. I think they do project out a no immigration or low immigration scenario. Um, but uh, without the figures, I do know that it wouldn't look good for our economy. We just wouldn't be getting the tax revenues we need. We'd probably have to borrow more money as a country, and we already have a very high national debt. So I can just say that the consequences wouldn't be good for our country.
That's right. Yeah, the other thing too on the economic argument for this is that there's this really weird thing that's been happening in the labor market. I don't know if you guys have studied it at the BPC, where there's this consistent multi-million dollar unfilled open jobs number. Like I think it got as high as like 12 million. There's 12 million jobs that haven't been filled, or 10. I think maybe now it fell down to maybe 10 million. But to me, that's crazy. It's 10 million jobs. And my hypothesis is that, you know, who could fill those jobs? A bunch of H-1B workers and immigrants. And that's another kind of no-brainer. And it would be a humongous economic advantage. Imagine if you just added 10 million people to the payrolls of this country, what that would do to our numbers.
Yeah, I mean, the number of vacancies is larger than the number of unemployed people in the United States. So even if hypothetically we could get all of our unemployed individuals to work, that wouldn't fill all the open vacancies. And that wouldn't even be realistic in the first place because a lot of people can't work. So immigration really is the only answer.
Yeah. So that's the economy, which to me, that I feel like you could build an absolutely compelling case for why it's economically smart to reform this system. And you also mentioned number two, I think, was national security. Let's talk about that for a second.
Sure, yeah, there's a great quote from Winston Churchill's wartime military secretary. So he said that the Allies won the war because our German scientists were better than their German scientists. So the point is that skilled talent from across the globe has really driven advancements in US national security for decades. But the problem is, at the moment, and this is again can probably in part be linked back to our aging population, is that we have workforce shortages, and our military has been facing significant recruitment challenges in recent years. So immigrants have historically made up a significant proportion of our military, but their immigrant participation in the armed forces is at historic lows. And this isn't because immigrants don't want to serve. This is partly because they have to have a green card to enlist, and we've got these green card limits, and we have these growing green card backlogs as well. We don't have enough resources to process all the green card applications, and we have very restrictive limits that mean people are joining this backlog. So that's one of the key national security arguments, is we just don't have enough. We have these military recruitment challenges, and but it's not just our military. So there are a lot of jobs in our economy that are vital for our national security. So we had an event at BPC last year where Margaret Stock, who is an immigration attorney and retired lieutenant colonel, she told us that she's seen critical workforce shortages in her hometown of Anchorage, Arkansas. And so Anchorage is a major hub for aircraft cargo. But she said that the city's facing challenges in finding enough native-born Americans to occupy positions like pilot positions, mechanic roles, support staff placements, and this may not people may not fully realize how vital these roles are for our national security. It's not just our military; it's also all of these these STEM based roles that are sort of feeding into our military and our national security.
Right. It's like all the supply chain logistics and the production of the goods you need to run a massive military like ours. I never really thought about the military recruitment thing before. That's kind of fascinating. What in is there a time period? I mean, I'm thinking back historically. Like, obviously, the American Civil War was a period where the North, in particular, drew on immigrant populations big time. Like, there was a whole bunch of people that were coming off of the boats in New York City and like immediately entering the Union Army. But what about the War on Terror? Was that a feature of the War on Terror where the military was drawing upon immigrants?
I'm not admittedly 100% sure of if particular instances where we were particularly reliant on immigrants. I think it's been just a recurring feature of our military and our military efforts. But yeah, I don't have any sort of firm data on that.
Yeah. And it strikes me, just thinking about it from a philosophical standpoint, the immigrant makes for a very good candidate for the military, is a person who voluntarily wants to come to this country. And if they also subsequently voluntarily want to serve our military, the odds are they're going to make for a good soldier or good member of the armed forces, because it's just like this motivation to be a part of this and to earn their place in America. It seems like another no brainer. I guess that's the theme of this conversation. And then the other one too. I just watched Oppenheimer, so I know that quote well, and that goes back to the conversation we've been having this whole time, really, which is like there's some very strategic reasons why we would want to be smart about immigration policy when it comes to super talented scientists and technologists, and you could just create a list of critical things. And there's historical precedent for why it's a good idea, like AKA World War II. Yeah. Moving on, I think the other one you mentioned was international competitiveness. What's the story there?
Yeah, I mean it's a very similar story. So I think the most compelling argument here is when you consider emerging technologies like AI. The this AI is vital for our economy. It's vital for our competitiveness, and we have countries like China that are putting our lead at risk. So we are leading the way on AI development, but China is not far behind. And immigration and workforce and skilled talent is a key driver of progress in emerging technologies. And without immigration, we risk losing our status as the global leader. So I'll just give you like a few stats on how immigrants contribute to technological development. So nearly 2/3 of the top AI companies in the United States have immigrant founders or co-founders. And then when you look at uh, our students and our higher education system, 70% of full-time graduate students studying AI-related fields are international students. And there's another stat here about those doing doctorates. So doctorate holders performing research and development as a major work activity in the areas of computer and information sciences and electrical and computer engineering, 80% or more of those are foreign born. So we have, as you mentioned earlier, we have these students that are foreign born that are doing very, very critical study, STEM-based study. And yeah, it's a lot of them struggle to stay in the country after their studies and certainly struggle to make it all the way to a green card. So without them, I bring it back to this risk of losing our lead on things like emerging technologies.
Yep. Which would be a travesty. We can't allow that to happen, especially the fact that these people are studying in our universities. Fascinating. So what in your view, what needs to change in this framework of legal immigration? Obviously, we'll put the border to the side and we'll save that for another episode. So on the legal side, what do you think needs to happen?
Yeah, so it's a complex system, as I'm sure the listeners have got a picture of. And if it was easy to solve, I think we would have done it by now. There is no one easy fix, but there are lots of things that we really need. So I think some things I would emphasize. Firstly, I mentioned these visa limits that have not been changed since 1990. We need to raise these limits. We need to ensure they're fit for our current economic needs, and these limits can change perhaps automatically based on certain economic indicators, but they can't just stay constant for 30 years or more. So I think we need to raise them, certainly quite substantially, and we need to rebalance away from this focus on family reunification to make it more in line, so to raise employment-based immigration to be more in line with the family-based immigration. I mentioned these green card backlogs, which exist partly because of these annual limits, but also because these agencies that process applications don't have enough resources. So we need to give them more funding so that they can process these visas to address growing backlogs. I also mentioned earlier that we need to make it easier for people to essentially go through this funnel from temporary status to permanent status. So students need to find it easier to get green cards, and we need more dual intent pathways that I mentioned earlier. We need more of these temporary visas to be dual intent so that more people can apply for green cards. And when it comes to international competitiveness, I also think a really interesting option is to make new visa categories that can attract very specific top talent. So one option is an entrepreneur visa, which would bring even more ambitious innovators in areas like AI into our country. So that's a lot of information, a lot of changes, and that's not the end of the list by any means. But those are some changes that come to mind that I think would be really impactful. And what we really need is just to have this conversation a bit more than we're having at the moment, so that legislators can consider these ideas and work together to make them happen.
Yeah, for sure. I love that list. A couple follow up questions on it. What's your take on the magnitude of the change that needs to happen? So, if I remember right, the green card number was like 600,000 or something. What is it? What should it be?
Yeah, I guess I don't have a firm number on what it should be. I but I think it certainly should be a lot higher. That's which is an obvious thing to say, but yeah, I don't have a firm number, but I think we need to do that analysis, and we need to have that number be responsive to our economic needs. So um, I think that some sort of automatic formula where we calculate what the overall limit should be based on our economic needs. So there are certain economic indicators. One possible indicator is the dependency ratio, which is the ratio of those people who are dependent on federal benefits on people who don't work to the ratio of people who do work, and that could be an indicator of how our total green card limit should change. So I think there are conversations we should have about this, but we have to as well, because at BPC we're quite pragmatic. So we're not going to put out a number that we think is the best number, but know that it's probably unlikely to happen. So what we're emphasizing is that we need more legal immigration. We're not too prescriptive about the exact number.
Yep, and that makes sense. And I like your idea of the dependency ratio. Maybe another one to throw in there is this unfilled open positions number, because that if that stays large, that's the business case for the country to another part of the business case. The dependency ratio is obviously a big one, but the unfilled positions could be used. Yeah, you could come up with something that made sense. If you just put a little thought to it.
Yeah, and I mentioned earlier that the number of vacancies exceeds the number of unemployed people. That difference is in the millions. I don't have the exact number to hand, but that gives you some idea of of our shortage, I guess. And the fact that our overall limit for green cards each year is considerably less than 1 million. So that gives you some indication of how much it would ideally increase.
Yeah, it would be a huge jump, 2-3x or something like that. What is like a pro immigration country like Canada? Do you have, not to put you on the spot, but as a percentage of population, like what does their immigration numbers look like? Ours are obviously way less than 1% if we're only talking about 600,000 out of 330 million. But do you have any idea where Canada sits on that?
I don't have the number to hand, I'm afraid, but I do know they are embracing employment-based immigration certainly a lot more, and family-based immigration. So and their economy is benefiting from it quite clearly. So I think it's definitely a model for us to try and emulate.
Yep. Do you guys at BPC, or you personally, do you have a perspective on how the rebalancing should look? So right now it's 480,000 for family, 140 for employment. What do you all think is a better ratio or the right ratio?
Yeah, that's a difficult question to answer. I mean, we try to be pragmatic think tank. I think we really just want to see that imbalance reduce, and I guess we don't have an ideal ratio, but certainly I would say that personally, and I think this would be BPC's position as well, is that we currently have it dominated by the family based. I think we should have it dominated by our economic needs.
Yep. Yeah, so it would be like a complete, not a complete reversal, but a big change in the prioritization of the applications.
Yeah, absolutely.
You mentioned several times in this interview, but also in this list that you came up with, this question of the funding for resources to actually make the legal immigration system work. And I've actually been reading quite a lot about this recently, because it's also an issue that relates back to border security, which is, I guess the issue, that my understanding of it is essentially there's not enough government employees who process these applications, or administrative law judges who make the determinations to even like remotely handle the caseload. And that's part of the reason why for quite some time now it's been broken. Like if you're an asylum seeker or whatever, you basically can't get an answer from anybody because there's nobody there to like review your application. How big of a problem is that? And could it be something that could be addressed? Like if we just decided to allocate the resources to it, would it be easy to do? What's your take on all that?
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of different backlogs in the system. So we've got asylum cases in the backlog in our courts. I think there's 3 million in the backlog there. We've got 7.6 million roughly in our green card backlogs. And increasing resources to process all of these cases is one really important way to address the backlog. And that means more funding for more people. There's also possibilities to improve the actual efficiency of the processes, to digitize more. And in the case of the green card backlog, I mentioned another really, perhaps the key way to address this backlog is to raise those annual limits. So if you raise the annual limits, that allows, well, you need both in tandem. So you need to raise the annual limits, and you also need more processes to actually process the applications within those limits. So
Yep.
funding is really important, but it's also changing our laws as well.
That makes sense. Yeah, I mean that number is staggering. Like 7.6 million is over 10 years of, right? Do I do the math right? It's over 10 years of green cards that people are just waiting for an answer on.
Yeah, and something I didn't mention earlier, which is also a key feature of our green card system, is that no more than 7% of the total limit can go to any one country. So you get certain countries like India that have much higher demand, a lot of people who are being sponsored for green cards. And so Indians, a lot of them are going to not actually ever receive their green card. They're going to die before they receive their green card because the backlog for them is even much longer than for others because of this country-specific limit.
Yep.
So, I mean, we're talking decades and decades for certain people in the backlog.
Yeah. And that is that 7% number part of that 1990 legislation, like along with these other numbers we've been talking about on the caps? Was that all statutorily defined at that time, or is it a hodgepodge?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that the 7% was part of the 1990 Act. Yeah.
Yeah. What do you think, like sitting here today? Obviously, this is an absolutely crazy time in American politics. We've got this election that looks like it's going to be, crazier than 2016 and 2020. What do you think the prospects for getting any of this done are?
Yeah, I've mentioned a few relevant things here. So the border is a big blocker to legal immigration reform. If it's taking up a lot of the attention, I think if we were, and we got we got this bipartisan border deal just last week. Unfortunately, it didn't get through. But I think it's very hard to predict. I think it also depends on who wins the presidency, what the makeup of the next Congress is. But I think I'm optimistic. It might not happen it's certainly not going to happen in this Congress, I would say, but I'm optimistic that the border crisis will have to come up with some solutions there. And then when we've done that, I think that will open the door and open the conversation to the legal immigration reform in a greater way than it has been so far. So I think that it's very hard to predict, but I'm quite optimistic myself.
Yeah, I hope so too. And maybe the border, I kind of agree with you. The border crisis is so acute that it's going to demand a solution at some point, probably even before the election, because it's such a big issue. And maybe that will provide the momentum for the Americans. Why do you think American politicians on either side of the aisle, why do you think no one is out there, pounding the table about these legal immigration reforms that we talked about, especially the pro economy ones? I find it odd that you find nobody on the national political scene who's out there saying, "Hey, guess what? I found a secret sauce to add $7 trillion to our economy and improve our international competitiveness." Why do you think no one's talking about it?
Well, it's not true that no one's talking about it. So we do have lawmakers from both sides actually introducing bills in Congress that would enact meaningful reform. So I mentioned the Eagle Act earlier. We did have a comprehensive reform bill introduced last year called the Dignity Act as well. I think the problem is that again, it's the border is drowning out these voices. So there are strong voices in Congress making the argument for legal immigration reform, but it's being drowned out by the border, and I think that is really probably the root of the issue at the moment. So there are lawmakers. We talk to them. We work with them to draw up legislation. It's just facing this blocker at the moment, and it's politics. It's an election year. The border is dominating the discussion. So I think that's probably the main reason why we're not hearing these voices, even though they do exist.
Yeah. Well, that's encouraging that there's at least some people kind of focused on it. To me, it seems like it's such a positive story that you could spin. Like even at the presidential debates, like I'm trying to remember back, 2020 was a long time ago, but I don't think this came up in 2020. Like I don't remember this being like an issue that any one of the candidates was like, "Hey, why don't we think about doing this with H-1B visas or the college the temporary visas for kids going to Harvard and Caltech and MIT?" Like that seems like it would win. There's a lot of Americans on both sides of the aisle who would say, "Yes, I'm in for that," because it makes so much sense. Maybe this time around it'll come up.
Yeah, and I mentioned the survey that BPC did in 2021, finding that legal immigration reform was an area that has a lot of potential for bipartisan action. We found that it's not top of either party's list, but it is both parties do feel positively towards it. But because it's not top of either party's list, it again that's why it can sometimes get under the radar. So, but it is one of I would emphasize it is the area where we have this really strong agreement, even though it's not top of the list.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, Jack, this has been a phenomenal conversation. I learned a ton, and I know our listeners will as well. So thank you for taking the time. I guess a couple more questions just to close this out. How did you get so interested in this field? I'm curious your personal connection to immigration.
Yeah, well, I don't have a sort of emotive story that some people in immigration policy have about they're immigrants themselves or their parents are immigrants. I mean, people can probably tell from my voice that I'm from the UK originally. I am actually a US citizen. I'm a dual UK US citizen, and I think my interest in the topic really came from I had quite an easy, privileged upbringing, and I just wanted to improve the lives of others and improve our prospects for the future. That drove me to study economics, and that drove me to immigration policy, which is really one of the best ways to support our economy. And I think that there's a saying in the US, it's the economy, stupid, which is economic growth has given us so much over the past few centuries, and I think I want to do what I can to continue that and to really set us up for prosperity in the future. And actually, if I could just mention, there's some really interesting research about economic growth and its impacts on our moral progress as well. So there's this book called The Moral Consequences of Economic Growth by Benjamin Friedman, and that finds that when we've had times of fast growth, we've had times of fast moral progress as well. So it's just this desire from me really to contribute to our economic progress, and thinking that immigration reform is one of the best ways to do that.
Yeah, I love that, and I had never heard of that book, but I'm absolutely going to check it out. I just thinking about the premise, my first reaction is it 100% makes sense, because as you struggle, like if you're an individual who struggles at the margins of economic life, it's very difficult to even think about making progress in other areas of your life, which are necessary for moral growth. Like you've got to be able to read, you've got to be able to, support your family and friends. And if you're just like on the edge of life, like barely surviving, the likelihood that that's going to happen is low. And then you also get forced into compromised positions to survive. And that degrades not only yourself, obviously, but it degrades society. So that's a fascinating subject, and I'm glad you recommended that book. I'm gonna have to check that out. Last question for you: for people who are interested in supporting this work and the work of maybe even bipartisanship in general, what can they do? What's one or two things that they can do to help in this mission?
Well, I would recommend everyone follows the Bipartisan Policy Center. So we have a website, of course, bipartisanpolicy.org, and I would recommend that people just we do a lot of useful research. We do a lot of explainers, and if you look at the content on our website, I think you can clue yourself in to a lot of these important policy areas, and that will enable you to have more informed conversations with various people, and to really counter misinformation and promote meaningful solutions that will actually improve lives. And you mentioned at the start that there's this podcast called This Week in Immigration. So I co-host that with my colleague Teresa Cardinal Brown. So she's been in the area of immigration policy for over 30 years. So she knows everything about everything, and we talk about important topics in immigration policy, going beyond what I've mentioned today, and we have lots of interesting guests on. So I would recommend people just follow our work, Bipartisan Policy Center, and make sure they're informed about these topics, and so they can have really informed conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will make sure to include the links to both the podcast, which I've been really enjoying. I've been listening to the most recent episodes, trying to get myself up to speed on this conversation, but also on the border stuff as well, because I want to cover that. And it's great. And so I encourage people to listen to This Week in Immigration. And yeah, love the mission of Bipartisan Policy Center. So, Jack, thank you for all your time and insights. This has been super informative, and just appreciate you taking time out of your day to be here.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Nick.